I am Richard RJ Eskow. In this age of rising Islamophobia, of so much conflict around the issue of Islam and Muslims in our culture, I have long looked to our next guest for wisdom and perspective on this. Juan Cole is collegiate professor of history at the University of Michigan. He is the author of a number of books, including Napoleon's Egypt, Engaging the Muslim World and the New Arabs. And he is also, by the way, the creator and editor of the Informed Comment website, which I really recommend you read. It's got a lot of great perspective. And he has a new book out entitled Muhammad, Prophet of Peace Amid the Clash of Empires. So I thought that would be a great reason to talk. I've been reading it, getting a lot out of it. So first of all, Juan Cole, thanks so much for coming on the program.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
And secondly, I guess the obvious question that you're going to get, particularly in this country, in this political climate, is a lot of people watching Fox News or wherever, listening to the president maybe, have gotten the idea that Islam is a warlike religion. And I think some of them would actually be surprised and shocked to hear him described by a historian with expertise in this area, great expertise in this area, as a prophet of peace. So just as an opener, can we talk about that for a minute? What made Muhammad a prophet of peace?
Well, Muhammad's career falls into two main eras. One, about a decade in his hometown of Medina when he preached as a prophet. And there, his hometown of Mecca, I meant to say. There in Mecca, he clearly, if we go by the Quran, was preaching turning the other cheek. The Quran instructs the believers who were harassed because of their monotheism by the militant pagans of the city, instructs them to wish peace upon their persecutors, and peace in the sense of prosperity, well-being, harmony. And there are many such verses in the Meccan period, which, in my view, haven't received proper attention. And then the militant pagans chased the early believers in Muhammad's mission away to a nearby city of Medina. And then the pagans came after them. They organized battalions and attacked them in hopes of taking the city and crushing the new movement and killing the believers. So the Quran instructs them to defend themselves, and it admits that they didn't want to. They were more or less pacifists, and it says that, well, some things may be better for you and you don't realize it. But what the Quran commands are defensive maneuvers. And this is in accordance with the ethics of the time. St. Augustine, St. Ambrose in the Christian Roman Empire said the same thing, that Ambrose said that if you let an aggressor kill an innocent in front of your eyes, then you're as bad as he is. And so that you should defend yourself and defend your city is not controversial. And people who don't like Islam have frankly taken these verses commanding the believers to defend themselves completely out of context. And they're also, frankly, not very well translated. And so they've been used to smear the Muslims. But it's a dispassionate consideration of them would find that there's nothing objectionable in what they say.
You know, what struck me in reading about this topic in general, and I've read a fair amount on it, and what your book, I think, is crystallizing for me, was, among other things, was there seems to be this bizarre alignment of interest between Islamophobes and extremists, so-called militants within who use the religion as a whatever pretext or context, whatever you might call it, for violent activities. That they both benefit from taking some of these Quranic passages out of context, distorting them, perhaps mistranslating them, that there's an odd sort of confluence of interest between that small group of people who engages in terrorism from within the Muslim world and the people who would have us hate all Muslims. Does that make any sense?
Sure. Well, the extremists do misinterpret these verses. For instance, the Quran says that you should fear God. It was the same sentiment as in the Bible. God fearing is a virtue. And then at one point when the pagan Meccans are attacking the Prophet and the believers in Medina, they are commanded to defend themselves. But if the Meccans rethink and offer an armistice, then they're to make peace. So this is a defensive maneuver. And in the course of the battle, the Quran says, strike fear into the heart of the enemy. Uses that same word as is used for fearing God. Well, striking fear into the heart of the enemy is a good idea because then you don't have to fight the enemy if you can make them run away out of fear of you. And the killing is less. And St. Augustine recommends that when Christian soldiers are on the battlefield, that they try to strike fear into the hearts of their enemies. So this is a commonplace. But there are extremists who take that part of that verse and say, well, it says we should strike fear in people's hearts. We should do terrorism. Not what the Quran is saying. It's saying that it's as a battle tactic. You should try to make the enemy afraid. And then Geert Wilders or other Islamophobes have also taken up this line. But since the Quran urges people to fear God, it uses the same verb. It can't possibly be talking about terror in that verse because it's talking about a healthy fear.
So you have, that's one example of the verses that have been taken out of context. And then I've seen that, the Islamophobes, and that's quite an industry nowadays, they also have the habit of, it seems to me, of seizing on any, I'm thinking of the notion of abrogation, that they can say, because they read it somewhere, that all those peaceful, beautiful verses in the Quran and so on, that defenders or of Islam or just rational, neutral observers cite, although they don't really matter because the verse that says, kill the enemy comes later. And what's the response to that?
Well, this theory of abrogation was come up with in medieval times by Muslim jurists, but it wasn't intended to be applied to values. And in fact, many of the great commentators say it's illegitimate to apply it to values. So, early on, the people around Muhammad drank alcohol, and later on, the Quran urges that they not do that. So the first time mention of alcohol is there. It says, "Don't come to prayers drunk." Well, that means it's all right to drink, except don't drink before you come to Friday prayers. And later on, the Quran says, well, there's good and bad in gambling and alcohol, but the bad in them is worse than the good, which I think is a pretty self-evident principle. So the Muslim jurist said, well, then later on, alcohol is forbidden altogether. And so that's a kind of incident where they developed this idea of abrogation. But the great Muslim thinker Tabari pointed out that this has only to do with laws, not with values. And so you can't say that the Quran recommends a preference for peace and an option for peace as the first response to harassment. You can't say that that was later abrogated. And it's very clear that the Quran only permits the taking up of arms in self-defense, which, again, is just ordinary ethics of the era, and I think of our era as well. So this theory of abrogation was not accepted universally in Muslim law. the great thinker Shawali Allah of Delhi, a reformer of the 18th century, said there were only 5 incidences of it. And so, yes, you could find some medieval warmonger who wanted to turn the Quran into such an instrument, but it's not a universal way of thinking.
And again, we're talking with Professor Juan Cole about a new book on Muhammad, Prophet of Peace, amid the clash of empires. Let's talk about the clash of empires for a second. You describe Muhammad and indeed the entire group of the peoples that he came from as sandwiched between the Roman Empire and the Sasanian Empire in Iran. So you have, in my mind, I picture a fairly, certainly not a powerless group of people, but essentially a community of traders in Mecca. That Muhammad is born into a prominent clan, but he's an orphan, so he doesn't have that much influence. He comes eventually to lead a community and then returns to Mecca, and we can go back to all of that. But how does being in this part of Arabia, sandwiched between these two empires, affect the whole notion of Muhammad as a figure of peace?
Right. Well, I call it a world war. In 603, war broke out between the Roman Empire and the Sasanian Persian Empire or Iranian Empire. Those were the two great polities in the Mediterranean and into Central Asia of that era. And they had fought encounters from time to time, back and forth, but the border between them was kind of the Euphrates River. So the Romans had Syria, what is now Jordan, Palestine, Israel. The Iranians had what is now Iraq, as well as what is now Iran and parts of Pakistan and Central Asia. So they went at each other from time to time. But what happened in 603 was unusual in history, in the sense that the Iranians were able to take all of Syria, greater Syria, including the Transjordan and Israel, Palestine. They took Jerusalem in 614. Then they went on and took Egypt by 619. So it really had been centuries since the Iranian Empire was so big and powerful, and it deprived the Eastern Roman Empire of the Egyptian breadbasket. There were horrible massacres, and people were transported back to Iran if they had valuable skills. They were stonecutters or whatever. This was an incredible set of events, and it went on for decades, from 603 into probably early 630. And so Muhammad's preaching was in that context, and the Quran refers to these events. It refers to the fall of Jerusalem, and it refers to the fall of Syria to the Iranians. And the Quran, I think, very clearly takes the side of the Eastern Roman Empire, of the Christian Empire, against the Zoroastrian Iranians. I think in part because it sees the Iranians as an aggressor.
That's interesting. And it also, if I recall my history right of that era, and there were also at least one, perhaps more incidents of Muhammad, for example, offering a mosque to Christian monks or Christian travelers for their prayers, and offering protection to monasteries. Wasn't there something like that in the history of Muhammad's life as well?
Sure. In the Quran itself, at one point it says that these defensive battles that the early believers around Muhammad fought to keep the pagans, militant pagans of the Western Arabia in check. It says that these battles had the side effect of protecting churches and monasteries. And I think being implied that the Bedouin would have gone up and raided those monasteries and churches in southern Jordan if the believers had not stop them. So there's, and then the Quran says the closest in love to the believers are the Christians, because they have monks and priests, and they're humble and they're kind and forgiving and loving. It's praising them for Christian virtues, but it's also clearly indicating a kind of political alliance with the Christians and as you say, an interest in protecting them. Another verse castigates the Jews and the Christians for attacking one another's houses of worship. The sources allege that many of the Jews in the former Roman domains that were conquered by Iran went over to the Iranians, that they felt better treated by the Zoroastrian Iranians than they had by the Christian emperors of Constantinople, and that there were attacks on churches by them, and likewise we know that the synagogues were attacked by Christians. So the Quran has a verse in which it castigates them for this. It says, you both believe in the Bible, you should be reciting it and copacetic with one another, and kumbaya, and nobody should enter a house of worship with mayhem on his mind. You should enter it, praising God and being pious. And it implies both synagogues and churches should be respected. So these verses, if you put them all together, they make a very clear picture that the Quran is urging ecumenicism, positive relations among the religions, but where push comes to shove, it's willing to exercise force to protect Christians. And this is not a new phenomenon in history. A lot of the Arab tribes had signed on as auxiliaries to the Roman army and did provide protection to rural cloisters and monks. And I think the people around Muhammad, some of them had been involved in these activities, and they took up these values.
So, and then you have, of course, both Christians and Jews characterized as people of the book, as therefore believers, who, as you point out in your book, are destined to go to heaven if they believe appropriately and act appropriately. Then so Muhammad in his life, he begins the process of revelation. He preaches in Mecca. He and his followers are driven out to Medina, where they establish what we, I guess, would call a government now. And you describe the nation state that was created, or city state that was created under Muhammad in Medina, as a diverse nation of Abrahamians. And they were living under what's come to be called a Constitution of Medina by some. But so it was basically help me understand. I picture it as a confederation of tribes, all allied under the leadership of Muhammad. Is it with differing beliefs, but all swearing allegiance under this compact? Is that essentially right?
That is exactly right. When Muhammad went to Medina, I think he served as a mediator for political wrangling amongst these various tribes and clans. And from the Quran's account, there were, pagans, Christians, Jews, other groups are mentioned that we're not exactly sure who they are. And then a lot of people had come to follow Muhammad there. And Muhammad emerged, I think, as a senator, as a mediator amongst them. And people outside of his belief community acknowledged him as an authority. But this document that we have, the Constitution of Medina, clearly kind of sets up a sort of federalism, that each clan does some housekeeping of its own amongst its own members. And then they have joint responsibilities to defend the city. And it calls them all a nation, an ummah in Arabic. And it's clear that this is not a nation of Muslims, of people who follow Muhammad in specific. It's a multicultural rainbow nation. including Jews and Christians. And it says of the Jews that they are a member of this nation, but they have their religion and we have ours. And they're not to be harmed in any way. They're given civil protections, and but then they have to pledge to help defend the city. So this is a very remarkable document, and it's reflected. I think its values are reflected also in the Quran, and it makes clear that Muhammad's movement was ecumenical in character.
And you describe, for example, I mean, in trying to picture that initial society, that nation that was created in Medina, you talk in your book about, at one point, Muhammad either talked about or perhaps instituted a kind of sanctuary in Medina where it was forbidden to hunt or to cut down trees or carry weapons, which is, I would think, it feels extraordinary even today to imagine that. I would think in the context of the time and the place in which he was operating, I would think that would be an extraordinary kind of bucolic, utopian almost, ideal to want to establish.
It was, even before Islam, a custom of the Arabs, of the Arabic-speaking people of Western Arabia in particular, to have a shrine to a deity, and then they considered the area around that shrine to be a zone of peace in which tribal feuding was not allowed, because government was weak in that area and sometimes non-existent, and so tribes were the main social vehicle of authority. But then they would wrangle with one another, they would raid each other, there was always some trouble between them. But when they came into a shrine city like Mecca, and it seems Muhammad tried to make Medina into such a city, they weren't allowed to fight. And for that reason, commerce could flourish in those areas. And I argue that Muhammad was from a clan in Mecca, the Banu Hashim, who had as their function in life to keep peace around the shrine to God. And so that's one of the reasons for these emphases on peace and turning the other cheek and mediation and settling disputes that is in the Quran, is that Muhammad came from that group and that was their vocation.
So that's very interesting, and I'm just I'm curious. I know that in Muhammad's you describe it as kind of just war principles, the way that, for example, the Catholic Church has developed a just war doctrine over the centuries. But as part of his just war practices, Muhammad would say, for example, no killing of prisoners and so on. But he would also say, if I recall correctly, no cutting down of trees. So I'm struck by, I don't know if this was a standard practice at the time, that it was considered overly violent to cut down trees, which might make sense given the scarcity of vegetation in that area. But just to satisfy my curiosity, where does the cutting of trees come into all of this?
Well, that area around the shrine to the deity was sacred, and so you couldn't engage in sword duels in that area, but you also couldn't hunt. You couldn't hunt gazelle, and you just couldn't harm living things. But it's not a general principle. It's for a time and a place, so you could cut down trees as a tactic of war if you were away from the shrine city.
Oh, I see. Okay. And then also, in terms of reverence for living things, there was this story, I don't know historically if it's true or not, but there was this story that at one point the army was on the march under Muhammad, and he saw a mother dog nursing her puppies in the shade of a tree and made them go around. Do you know that story, or what this background is to that?
You know, after Muhammad's death, a folk literature grew up around him, that many such stories were told in Western Arabia, and then later on in the imperial capitals of Damascus and Baghdad. And there are literally thousands of sayings and doings attributed to the Prophet Muhammad. And as a historian, I don't, have anything against that literature, but I can't trust it. I mean, I can't write history out of it because it's not dated. It's a folk literature, and there were kind of aficionados who went around collecting these stories 200 and 300 years after the Prophet's death. So, it's kind of like me flying to Corsica and asking people for Napoleon stories now. And so in this book, I don't depend on that kind of anecdote or that literature. The book is very firmly based on the Quran, which I think is the only sure primary source we have from the early 7th century. But as I said, the Quran is full of those kinds of values of the milk of human kindness and going out of your way to be helpful to people and wishing peace even on your enemies. So that particular story that you told seems consonant with Quranic values.
And what also seems, and you quoted this passage, it seems that the Quran as a document and what we know of Muhammad's life is what we would call today strongly anti-racist. There's a story of Bilal, the freed black slave who was the first to make the call to prayer at the Kaaba. I don't know if that's true or not either, but there's that story. But you quote the passage in the Quran, and among his creations is if I'm quoting it correctly, is the creation of the heaven and earth and the variety of your languages and complexions. Surely in that are signs for all living beings. So is it fair to characterize Muhammad and the Quran as anti-racist?
Oh, absolutely. The Quran clearly encourages people to think about racial and ethnic and religious diversity not as a thing to regret, but as an opportunity to learn. Elsewhere, there's a verse that says that God made us male and female and different tribes and peoples so that we can learn from one another. And then goes on to say that the best of us is the most pious of us. So it implies that, a humble, poor tribe that's religious and ethical is better than a powerful, wealthy tribe. And moreover, it implies that a pious woman is better than an impious man. So on the ethical level, at least, the Quran, I think, is quite a progressive document, especially for the 7th century.
And on that point, maybe that's the last point we can take, Juan Cole, is people point to the fact that the Quran, for example, permits the taking of slaves under certain rules for treatment and so on, as making it primitive and not consonant or not consistent with, compatible with values of today's society. But I suppose it could be read, and Muhammad's life story can be read as a kind of progressivist take on institutions like slavery that were dominant at the time, that to outlaw it might have meant that he'd lose all his followers, but that by taking an evolutionary approach, because it praises the freeing of a slave as one of the highest acts a person can do, perhaps the highest act, that it was seeking to move toward the elimination of slavery and some of the other barbaric, what we would call barbaric, and certainly slavery is barbaric, practices of the time. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, to tell you the truth, I find the passages in the Quran about slavery a little puzzling, because right from the Mecca period, there's an emphasis on manumission being a good deed. And so just as you would give charity and help an orphan, the Quran says you should be freeing slaves. And elsewhere in the book, as you say, it does seem to recognize the legitimacy of the institution, as, of course, does the Bible. Indeed, at one point, the New Testament urges people to return runaway slaves to their owners as their property. The Quran, it seems to me, envisages a good society as one where the slaves are freed, but it does seem to recognize that the institution exists.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. That's very helpful. So, what else? We're running out of time. Is there anything else that people should know about your book before I let you go?
Yeah. Well, I think it's important that I take the Quran as our primary source because, as I said, many stories grew up about the Prophet in later centuries. Many of them, I think, scurrilous and don't reflect well on him. They maybe reflected values of medieval Baghdad. And so there are, all of these stories about massacres being ordered, and I think the Prophet was kind of militarized. Even the procession to Mecca, when it finally gave in and accepted his leadership and stopped fighting him, I think in the Quran that is portrayed as a civil disobedience of a sort. It's a nonviolent cavalcade of believers went off to Mecca under threat of death from the militant pagans who decided in the end not to commit a massacre and to let them into the city. And the Quran describes this, and the Quran exults that there was no violence in this incident where the believers came back to Mecca and were allowed then to worship at the shrine there, the Kaaba. Later, Muslim commentators, seems to me, missed the ironic and peaceful character of this event entirely, and they depicted it as a kind of a military engagement. The Quran very clearly denies this.
Well, it sounds like a classic case of projection, perhaps, but unfortunately, we are going to have to leave it there. But Juan Cole, the book is Muhammad, Prophet of Peace Amid the Clash of Empires. Thanks for writing it, and thanks so much for coming on the program.
Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely.